So again, welcome everyone. We sure appreciate your time today and joining us. We have a great session planned for today. May I have your attention, please? Would the real cloned item please stand up? Joining today are two of my colleagues, Tara Williams, Chief Editor for Cavion Test Development Services, and Jennifer Miller, Data Forensics Coordinator. First of all, a little about Tara. Tara has been the Chief Editor with Cavion, where she's headed up content development and item review for various clients, IT clients, online universities, all types of clients. She presented at ATP this year on editing best practices, and now she's focusing all her attention on cloning and all things cloning, especially in relation to development and implementation. Before joining Cavion, Tara taught English and composition at George Mason University, where she also received a Master's in Fine Arts and Creative Writing. Jennifer Miller has been with Cavion for about 1.5 years with our data forensics team. She is the data forensics coordinator. And Jennifer and her team work with clients on forensic analysis of test response data for high-stakes assessments, as well as planning and forensic investigation of test security breaches. So quite the expertise in this panel today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tara.
Thanks, Rochelle. You can move to the next slide. The next one after this. Thank you. So the agenda for today, we're going to begin with just cloning 101, the basics. Then we'll move to trends in cloning, challenges and solutions, and then also using clones to deter and to detect cheating. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin this session with a quick poll. And the question is, what is the biggest challenge facing your test development program? A, item exposure. B, high development costs. C, restricted access to qualified subject matter experts, also known as SMEs. And D, other, since as we know, there are a multitude of challenges that exist in testing. Go ahead and cast your vote.
We'll give people another minute to vote. Looks like we have about half of the audience that's voted so far. So go ahead and cast your vote. Okay, just about 5 more seconds. Close that poll. Great, thank you. So I will go ahead and share the results with you.
All right, it looks like 43% of you chose item exposure. So a lot of you are interested in the security, which we're going to talk about more. We can move to the next slide. All right, so the challenges of test development shared by everyone developing exams, from IT to cosmetology, are in fact security, as 43% of you suggested, high price of development, and restricted access to qualified SMEs. I would be interested in finding out what some of the challenges are for those of you who chose other. I think there were like 14%. Maybe during the Q&A session we can talk more about that. Next slide. Okay, so cloning is a multifaceted solution to these test development challenges. It can be used as a security measure to keep users at bay, changing up the questions, keeping them guessing. It can be used to increase item count, since it enables the creation of new items quickly and efficiently. It can keep costs down also, since it is typically a quick and efficient practice, and in some cases it allows non-subject matter experts to create the items for you. And finally, it can protect the time of your subject matter experts, since creating clones should take far less time than creating original items. Move to the next slide, please. I'd like to back up just a bit here and talk about what cloning actually is for those in the audience who may be new to this practice. Simply put, a clone is an item based on the content of another item. A clone aligns to the same objective as the original item, but is altered so that a candidate with pre-knowledge has less of a chance of gaining an unfair advantage on the exam. And here on the screen is an example of an original item on your left and then a cloned item on your left, or on your right. You can see that the end portion of the stem there, oh yeah, no problem. The end portion of your stem there has been altered, rendering different answer correct. So we went from piquant choice A being correct to discursive D being correct. Can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, it leads us to our next poll question. Have you used cloning in your program? Yes, no, unsure.
Okay, this should be an easy one. Give people about 5 more seconds to vote. The votes are coming in quickly this time. Okay, looks like we have almost everyone's vote, so I will go ahead and share those results.
All right, it looks like 67% of you have, 24% haven't, and about 9% are unsure. All right, so let's actually dig a little bit deeper now into the topic. We have a pretty high percentage of you who have used clones, and we can hopefully shed some more light on this practice for all of you. After writing and editing clones for several years, as well as managing cloning projects, I have noticed some trends in cloning. Number one, people seem to be moving from a reactive approach to a more proactive approach. With item exposure occurring sometimes just 3 weeks after publication, program managers want to be prepared for what is often the inevitable. Number two, people are using item design to enhance security. This can be seen in the form of Chameleon items and also DOC items. Secure item design can be placed into 2 functional categories, though: design that deters and then design that detects. And I'd like to talk just a little bit more about the trend of proactivity. Next slide, please. So a proactive approach to security can be compared to the making of sourdough bread. For those of us who are unfamiliar with the process, this is pretty much how it works. There's a baker who begins by creating a starter. And the starter consists of flour and water. And over a period of days, the starter grows as wild yeast is produced. The baker continues to nurture the starter by feeding it more water and more flour until finally it's fully developed, done. However, the bakers can preserve that starter, increasing its longevity by removing a portion of it and then adding more flour and water to it. And this is a continuous process. You subtract a portion and then you add a little bit in. You subtract a portion, then you add a little bit in, and so on and so forth. Next slide. Maintaining exam health is similar. You build your bank over a period of time, adding the right ingredients, like your accuracy review, your first edit, your final edit, etc. And you get it just right. Once it's developed, though, you can preserve its longevity by removing certain items and then adding cloned items in. Next slide, please. The second trend I noted was using item design to enhance security. Here's an example of a chameleon item. So it's an item that deters and detects cheating. I want to take just a moment to talk about what's happening on the screen here in this item type. First of all, it is 4 items in one. The first blank needs to contain a noun. The parameters of the noun are defined by the rest of the stem. So the noun must be rectangular and it has to have dimensions. As you can see, the first version of the item will have the word garden in the first blank. The numbers 15 and 13 are the dimensions, and the correct option is 195. That's just one version of the item. The other versions of the item will have a different noun and different dimensions swapped in, rendering a different option correct. Every version of the item will contain the same set of answer choices. So in this case, it's 195, 225, 165, and 169. Next slide, please. All right, so we just spoke a little bit about the vision, sort of the trends of what we're seeing and really big idea concepts. So the trends and possibilities of cloning are super exciting. However, there are certain challenges that can prevent programs from gaining full advantage of the security best practice. And I want to discuss those now. Next slide, please. Okay, so these challenges are based on my experience with cloning. And I'd like to discuss them starting at the very broad level, the industry level, and then narrow down into specifics and get into the nitty-gritty of the item level. Next slide, please. On the industry level, we haven't gotten to the point where cloning nomenclature is standardized. What is a clone to one person may not be a clone to another. What I've noticed is this: a clone's form, that is its structural requirements, should be dictated by its function. That is, what kind of benefit you want the clone to provide. For example, an organization that is in the market of producing practice test questions will not necessarily have the same requirements of the clone as an organization that wants to use cloning to deter cheating on a high-stakes exam. So I believe we need to standardize our wording surrounding both form and the function of clones. Next slide. Here's what a possible solution could look like. You name the type, you define it, and then you just list its use cases. And this kind of information can be shared across your program, across stakeholders, across subject matter experts, editors, and content reviewers, just to ensure that everyone is synced up. Next slide. Thanks. So on the program level, some of the concerns are untrained personnel, and not just untrained subject matter experts, but untrained personnel such as, like I said just now, editors, content reviewers, program managers. And then second, outdated item development tools. Next slide. And here are some possible solutions to those issues. Number one, you can hold an educational session in the development phase. So basically, anyone who will touch a clone, I think, should be trained. Number two, really just have realistic cost and time expectations that reflect the limitations or the capabilities of your development tool. I think you'll expect an increase in time and cost when using tools that don't auto-create clones and their IDs, or tools that don't track changes, or tools that don't have a window that offers ease of comparison between like the original clone, the original item, and your clone. Next slide. And next we have some exam level challenges that I've noticed. And here are two key issues that can present problems when cloning. Number one, just items that lack alignment to course material. And number two, items that lack rationale statements. Next slide. A solution would be to make two things standard in any test development process that you use. Number one, an audit of item alignment to course material. Typically, we trust our SMEs to do this, but sometimes the trust can be misplaced, and the issues in the originals will be transferred to the clones. So you'll have double the issues. You'll double the items, but you'll also have the same issues from the originals transferred to your clones. And number two, inclusion of effective item rationales that describe why the correct answers are correct and why the incorrect answers are incorrect. Well-written item rationales are logical, specific, and direct, making it very easy for a non-SME to go in there and quickly create clones. Next slide. And finally, we have some item level challenges. And I should mention that these challenges are not necessarily things that need to be rectified. Rather, they're limitations that need to be understood by the stakeholders. some of these challenges include inflexible language, in other words, language that's not conducive to synonym swaps, or inflexible syntax, and that is syntax that's not conducive to paraphrasing or restructuring. And finally, items that lack variables that can easily be swapped in and out. Next slide, please. All right, so there are two possible ways to develop at the item level with cloning in mind. First is the design-driven approach, where form of the item is driving the content typically. SMEs would be required or encouraged to create the Chameleon item type, for instance, and not just your typical multiple choice or multiple select. There are some considerations when using this approach, I think. Basically making that decision between, are you going to require your SMEs to do this, or are you going to somehow encourage them to do it? Also, I think that this approach is going to require experienced SMEs who already grasp psychometric best practices. I think they're higher level concepts, so if you have SMEs still wrangling with concepts such as psychometric best practices, I think you'll find some issues there. Also, a lot of content readily lends itself to this format, but some doesn't. And so you'll have to try to figure out which content lends itself to this format and which doesn't. A pro is that you have clones built in without having to spend too much extra time and money on the process. And then we have number two, which is a process-driven approach, where the SMEs would create items without considering structure or clonability. They're not worried about clones. They're just worried about alignment to objective, relevance, accuracy, the big things there. Then the items are assessed to see if their structure is conducive to multiple renditions. So a content reviewer might flag these types of items, and then a SME or a non-SME would quickly jump in and clone the items. I think the pro of this approach is that there's limited formal restrictions, and so the form won't be dictating the content. However, the previous approach may be time-saving. So it's just a decision I think a program will have to make, depending on factors. Next slide. Okay, so finally, we have the overall challenge of determining when a clone is actually a clone. Sometimes it's just hard to tell, but if we can define and communicate the function of our clones, I think we'll be better able to judge if a clone is sufficiently altered. And I'd like to just take a look at a general example real fast here. Next slide. All right, so we have a sample item on our left, and then we have a sample clone of that item on your right. The red highlights represent the changes made. And I want to take just a moment on this slide, and I'd like the attendees to think about if you think the changes are sufficient. And this will actually lead us to our next poll question, but I don't want to switch slides yet. I want to give the attendees a chance to just review the clone and consider if they think it's a clone or if they don't. And I'll let you know when I want to move on to the next slide. All right. I think everyone should have been able to read that content by now. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide and have our poll question. So is this a clone? Yes or no, or unsure?
Okay, so people are voting. Give you a couple more seconds to vote. And Tara, when we're done with this poll, I do have a couple questions I'd like to pose to you before we move on. So
All right.
Before we pass it off to Jennifer, we'll cover those quickly. Okay, looks like just about everyone has voted, so I will go ahead and share those results.
All right. 22% said yes, 67% said no, and 11% were unsure. We can move to the next slide. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, I do think the formal requirements of a clone are going to be dependent on how you want to use it. But in this case, we're just speaking generally about this clone. And I think that if there are other variables that can be swapped in and out, why not do it for extra security? And so here we have an example of a few more variables being changed up to ensure that your clone is actually a clone and it's going to do its job right. So we have the numbers changed in the stem. Actually, they're just swapped here. 20 meters comes before the 10 meters, and that makes the mathematical equation quite different. It makes it so different, in fact, that it renders number 4 the correct answer. So we have a different correct answer for enhanced security. And then we've also swapped out some variables. So here we have a lighting engineer is shining the stage light. All right, so we have a little bit more wording in there that can distract someone who may have pre-knowledge. And the next slide. So here are the key points summarized. There are exciting possibilities with cloning. Implementing them requires developmental considerations, which I think are standardization of nomenclature, training personnel effectively, having realistic expectations of your development tool, making course alignment audit and rationale standard in your development process, and then understanding the concept of clonability. I don't think all items are created equally when it comes to cloning. And now I can take those questions, Rochelle.
Okay, great. So the first one is we referenced DOMC on one of the previous slides, and the person was just asking for a brief explanation on what DOMC is.
Yeah, sure. So it stands for discrete option multiple choice. So you'll have your question, and then you can have as many options as you want in your bank, but the candidate is only going to see maybe 4 to 10, 4 options at a time. So even though you might have 20 options in your bank, they're going to be swapped out depending on the candidate and depending on the exam. And so it's an extra measure of security because not all of your options are going to be exposed.
Great. And just to sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that you can go ahead and expand on my definition if you'd like.
Yeah, and no, that's great. And actually, you can actually try it out if you want. If you go to trydomc.com, you can take several. There's several like practice tests, fun little tests in there that you can kind of see what that item type is all about. And I will include that URL in the follow-up email that I send out. Okay, the other question that we had come in, Tara, is if you can please explain the difference between a clone and a chameleon.
Sure. I think not all clones are going to be chameleons, but all chameleons are going to be clones. So what I mean is a chameleon is a type of clone. However, there are different types of cloning strategies available. So you don't have to use a chameleon. This is just one trend that we're seeing. Other cloning strategies include something I call cosmetic surgery, where you're really just altering the syntax and the wording of maybe the stem and the options. There are other kinds of strategies that you can use too. You can flip, for instance, your key into your stem and part of the stem into the key. And so those are examples of clones that aren't chameleons.
Okay, and that's all the questions I have for now, so we can go move on.
Okay, guys, thank you. I'm Jennifer Miller, the Data Forensics Coordinator, and I'll be talking briefly about using cloned items to help with the security of our exams. So if you go to the next slide, please. So as Tara mentioned, we found from our research and from our own experience in looking at test response data that items can be published, stolen, and then made available for use on the internet as quickly as 3 weeks after their publication. So that's a very quick turnaround time. So what I want to talk about today is how we can take advantage of our cloned items to deter and detect the use of brain dump content. So they're not only helpful in expanding our item bank and some of the other things that Tara talked about, but they're also helpful in increasing the security of our exam and also helping us detect the use of brain dump content. And we have two main objectives when we're talking about the security of an exam, for cloning for the security of an exam. The first objective is really simple. We want to devalue the brain dump content by confusing and misdirecting brain dump users. In other words, we want to make it difficult for cheaters to pass the test. So whether we can detect that or not, at the very least, we just want to make it harder for brain dump users to use the brain dump content. And then the second objective we have, which is equally as important, in my opinion, is we want to take advantage of our cloned items to detect the use of the brain dump content, and we can do that using data forensics. And something I just want to note about this is, particularly when we're cloning for security purposes, it's very important that our clone and difficulty and measurement properties to the original items. If we start changing the psychometric properties of the items or their difficulty when we clone them, then we introduce a lot of complications to the matter. And really, a well-designed clone is one that remains comparable to the original item in terms of its difficulty and measurement properties. Next slide, please. So a really good way to meet objective one, which is to devalue the brain dump content, is we can confuse and misdirect our brain dump users by taking advantage of the salient and trivial facts in the item stem. So salient and trivial facts are pieces of information in the item stem that are memorable but not important. And because they're memorable, our brain dump users tend to use them as mnemonic devices or just to recall them easier, which allows us to then confuse the brain dump user and thereby devalue the brain dump content. So what I want to do is I want to show you an example of that, but if you will go to the next slide, I just want to talk briefly about how the cloning method that you use when you're cloning for security purposes is critical to getting the results that you want. You can clone an item by simply changing the stem and not changing the answer to the item. So if that item looks like the old item, or if a brain who has access to the content recognizes the answer to the item, then the user is going to choose the old answer, which is still the answer to the cloned item. In other words, that item is still compromised. The brain dump user is still going to get it correct, and having cloned the item is not going to have helped us with respect to the security of the exam. The way we really want to do this, the preferred method, is to change the stem and then also change the answer of the item. And what we really want to do is change the stem. The user cannot tell the difference between the original stem and the cloned stem, and but we want the answer to the item to change, and so that when the brain dump user chooses an answer, they're tricked essentially into choosing the answer to the original item rather than the cloned item. And in this case, the item is not compromised. The new cloned item is not. And we've helped with the security of our exam. So I'm going to show you an example of that. If you'll go to the next slide. So what I have here are two items. We have an original and a cloned. The original item reads, the Yosemite Sam Drilling Company is installing a 200-foot, 2-inch diameter well at the sign. What is the recommended inside diameter of the PVC well casing? So the salient and trivial facts on this item are the Yosemite Sam Drilling Company and the Solvang Gold Mine. These two pieces of information conjure images of cartoon characters, a town in California, the gold rush in California, and so forth. So these are very memorable, but they're not at all important to the item. The answer to the original item is A, and then when we clone the item, we ever so slightly change the stem of this item. So we retained our salient and trivial facts so that we can attract the memory of the brain. Changed a very critical piece of information in this item stem, which was the depth of the well. In the original, it was a 200-foot well, and the cloned, it's a 20-foot well. Very difficult to see that change, but that minor change actually results in a change in the answer. And so now, for the cloned item, the answer is C. So a random user is going to come along. They're going to see this cloned item. They're going to think it's the original. They're going to choose answer A when, in fact, the answer is now C. And something really important to note about the way that we design these cloned items is that we want whatever difference we put in the cloned item, we want that to have no impact on legitimate test takers. We're trying to make it difficult for our brain dump users to pass the test, but we don't want our legitimate test takers to suffer or even know the difference at all. So in this case, a legitimate test taker who has studied for the content is going to know the difference between, is going to know the answer to either of these questions regardless of what the depth of the well is. So a legitimate test taker wouldn't even notice that they're taking a cloned item at all. So that's really important. And so if you'll go to the next slide. So I can show you how the confusing our brain dump users can actually show up in the data here. What we did was we performed a simulation using an actual test with actual items. We used the item response theory and using the measurement properties of the item to simulate the scores of brain dump users, assuming that they had knowledge of the test. So we assumed that the brain dump users had a theta value of somewhere between 2.5 to 3, and then we produced scores for those users, and we created a histogram, and what you're seeing here is the distribution of the frequency of the scores among those brain dump users. And the real thing to take away from this is the pass rate for these brain dump users was 94%. And then if you go to the next slide, we then republished the exam with 50% cloned items. And so these cloned items, we assumed, were similar to the example that I just gave, where it's very difficult for the brain dump user to recognize that they're seeing a cloned item. They believe they're seeing the original item. They choose the answer to the original item and therefore get the cloned item incorrect. Then we scored that test with the new answer key, and we saw that none of the brain dump users who in the previous group, none of those people passed the exam, the new exam with 50% cloned items. So the gist of this is that cloning can be really effective in devaluing brain dump content and making it so that cheaters can't pass the test. And that's pretty much objective 1 right there. If you go to the next slide. So up to now, I've been talking about how we confuse our brain dump users, but now what we want to do is we want to detect them. And we want to detect them for two reasons. First of all, we want to identify who they are. If we can identify who they are, we can use that information to take action, such as invalidate scores or take some sort of disciplinary action. Whatever our program allows, whatever the objectives of our program are, if we can identify who those individuals are, we can do something about it. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to use the information that we get from our test response data to determine when to republish items. So, as we mentioned, tests are being administered, stolen, and then made available for use on the internet all the time, and it happens very quickly. So what we want to do is get into a cycle where we can see when it's time to republish our exam because it's been exposed. And so we can use our test response data to do that. And if you'll go to the next slide. So I just want to walk you through a very simplified example of how we can do that. First of all, what we can do is we can look at our cloned versus new items. It doesn't really matter how you refer to them, but sometimes it can be helpful to look at them this way. So in this example, we have two exam forms. We have our original exam form, which was composed of 100% original items, and that form was stolen, made available on the internet, and now we as a test program suspect that it's been stolen and made available, or we suspect or we may even know that. So what we can do is we can republish our exam using 50% of the original items and 50% of the cloned items. So I just want to point out that in the example, we're only cloning 50% of the items. And the actual number of items that need to be cloned will depend on the type of the exam, the program. It can depend on many different factors. So it doesn't have to be 50%. This is just part of the example. But I do want to point out that we don't need to clone all of our original items. We can clone fewer than the original, and this can result in cost savings, but we can still have the same security benefits even if we don't republish the entire exam. If you go to the next slide. So the first things first, if we've done our job and we've cloned our items properly, then we've already met objective 1 by republishing the exam. In other words, we've devalued our brain dump content. Our brain dump users are going to get 50% of the items on the test incorrect as a result of being confused and misdirected by the cloned items. So check mark for objective number 1. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to detect the usage. So we're going to take our exam form 2, which is composed of 50-50, and we're going to produce 2 answer keys. The first answer key that we produce is called what we refer to as a flawed answer key. And this flawed answer key is based on answers to all the original items, not the cloned ones, but the answers to the original items on the test. And you can probably figure out that if we've cloned our items properly, then our brain dump users are going to answer predictably to these questions because they're going to think that they're looking at the original items and they're going to choose the answers to the original questions. And then we're going to produce a second answer key, which is going to be based on the correct answers for the Form 2 items. And then we're going to take all of our results, all of our test takers, and we're going to score their exams twice, once for each answer key. So if you'll go to the next slide. We're going to end up with 3 groups of people once we score the test twice. We're going to end up with the group in the blue circle, and these are people who score well on the new answer key. With people in the orange circle, and those are people who score poorly on both answer keys. Then we're going to end up with a group of people in the red circle at the bottom, and these are people who score well on the flawed answer key. And I think that we figured out who these groups are, but if you'll go to the next slide. Our blue circle, those are our prepared test takers. Those people knew the answers to the questions on the new form. We believe that they're legitimate test takers and they've done well on the test. Our next group, the orange group, these guys, unfortunately, are unprepared test takers. They didn't do well on the exam, but from a we don't believe they had access to brain dump content. And then the third group are our group at the bottom here, our naughty brain dump users. Those are people who did well on the flawed answer key. In other words, they answered predictably as though they had access to the original content of the exam. And so by separating these three groups, we statistically separate them. And when we're able to do that, we can distinguish between our different test takers, and we're able to isolate our brain dump users and then take whatever action we need in order to invalidate their scores or bar them from taking the test or whatever it is our program allows for. And that's very helpful in keeping brain dump users at bay. And then if you go to the next slide. So then what we can do is also take the information that we have to determine when we need to republish our items. And this is a really simple process. The first thing we want to look at is we want to notice when we can no longer distinguish between the groups. So when the mean scores of these groups, the differences between the mean scores of these groups approach 0, then we can no longer distinguish between them, and that's the suggestion that now our cloned content has been exposed, and that is now available for use by brain dump users, and then we can no longer tell the difference between those three groups of test takers. And then another line of evidence to suggest we need to republish our items is when the overall pass rate of the exam goes back up. So if we have an exam, the exam has a pass rate, then that exam is stolen, brain dump users are now in effect. The pass rate for that exam is going to go up because people are gaining an unfair advantage. Then we republish that exam with clones. We're going to make the pass rate go back down because the brain dump users are now ineffective. And then eventually that republished exam could be exposed, stolen and made available. Brain dump users start using that, and the pass rate goes back up. So pass rate go back up combined with not being able to distinguish between the groups of test takers, then that is a red flag for when we need to republish our items. And I went through a really simple example, but depending on the exam, the program, and a number of other factors, we can come up with publication and republication strategies that can be designed to maximize the security of the exam, but also minimize development costs. So this can become far more sophisticated, but can still be very effective in keeping brain dump users at bay and helping us with the republication of our. That is all I have.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and open it up for some questions. I have quite a few questions coming in, and so these are directed to both panelists, Tara and Jennifer. First of all, do you clone by hand or by computerized item generation?
Hey, Rochelle. Sorry, I was on mute while Jennifer was speaking. It depends on, we're a vendor at Cavion, and it depends oftentimes on what our client is using. At Cavion, we do have our own item development called Scorpion, and we tend to like to work in that because it does, just by a push of a button, I can create a clone, or at least it's a replica, really. So you have your original item, you push the button that says clone, and it creates a replica, and I can work in that replica with my modifications, and then it auto-generates the item ID, and it just saves. I have created clones not necessarily by hand, but yeah, by Word document, which is kind of equivalent to by hand these days. And so that has just different challenges and different limitations, and also it has some value. So yeah, I've done it both ways.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tara. Kind of along those lines, do you suggest using cloned items for practice tests?
I don't see why not. Like I said, Cavion is a vendor, and we're not in the market to create practice tests. But if our clients are, then we will, and we have helped them. I have fairly limited experience, I would say, in helping clients with creating clones for practice test items. But I don't see why not, and it seems like it would have fewer limitations than if you were creating clones for a high-stakes exam, which I believe some of the questions we're going to get to deal with stats. And I'm not exactly sure if organizations who are creating practice tests have to deal with stats as much as, say, your certification, your high-stakes certification exam, like your NCLEX.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question for either of you. Someone asked for just kind of a brief definition of a brain dump. Can you guys just review that for us?
Yeah, this is Jennifer. So a brain dump is kind of a colloquial term, but a brain dump website is a website that makes live test content available for purchase. A brain dump user is someone who purchases that live test content and then memorizes it and then gains an unfair advantage on by having that pre-knowledge. And then I guess a brain dumper could be either a user or it could be someone who's stealing the test content and making it available on the internet.
Thanks, Jennifer. Another question, does it ever make sense to clone a clone, or should you always work from your original item?
Yeah, I think if you're using cloning to simply to expand your item bank, let's just say you are in the market for developing practice exams, and you really just want to beef up your bank, I don't see why you wouldn't clone a clone. And in fact, the examples that we gave of like that chameleon type of clone, really in essence, that is a clone of a clone. If you create a chameleon that is conducive to like four items in one. So in essence, you have like one item and then 3 clones, and that's what a chameleon is. But again, I think it depends on the purpose of your program and your organization.
Okay, let me just see. We've got a bunch of questions, sort of statistical questions. Those are a little too complicated, I think, to get into on the panel, but we will provide you answers in our follow-up email. So those of you who have sent in specific percentage questions and p-values and things like that, rest assured we will address those. I'm going to take this one last question, and you guys can, either of you can jump in. You mentioned item compromise generally takes 3 weeks. Please state assumptions and expand discussion, such as continuous offerings, volume matter, multiple global sites, etc.
Yeah, I think that slide I took from Dennis Mains's COTS presentation in 2014. So that might be a question that Jennifer and her team may be able to answer better than I can.
So Rochelle, I heard most of that question, but could you just say it one more time?
Yeah, sure. You mentioned item compromise generally takes 3 weeks. Please state assumptions and expand the discussion, such as continuous offerings, volume matter, multiple global sites matter.
I'm not 100% understand it all, but that 3 weeks number was based on some research that we performed with some specific client data, where we.
Jennifer.
Yeah. Yep.
This is Steve. If you don't mind, I can jump in on this. So I wouldn't say it's a general thing. We had a situation where within 3 weeks, of the publication of a client's exam, there was evidence of unfair advantage being gained through compromised, stolen material. And so our assumption is that within the first week, the pirates identified that there was a new exam that was published, or a new form of the exam, and within the second week, they had pirated or stolen the items and marketed them for sale. And by the third week, candidates had located those on site, on the web, purchased them, memorized them, and gained advantage. It was pretty disheartening for all of us, and particularly our client, to realize that this kind of situation could arise in just 3 weeks. So that's one particular data point we're familiar with when we say things can be stolen, made available, candidates gaining advantage in as short a time as 3 weeks. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, Steve.
One last question that just came in. I don't know if you can address this on the call, Tara, or if it's something you'd prefer to write an answer to, but someone just asked that you compared chameleons to clones, but this still doesn't explain exactly what the characteristics of a chameleon are and how it works compared to the original item.
Okay, yeah, sure. So you have your original item. The original item has a correct answer choice. And in your clone, there's going to be something changed in the stem. And whatever that is changed in the stem is going to render one of your distractors from the original as the correct answer. And that simply is a chameleon.
Great, thanks, Tara. And we can provide maybe an example for our follow-up email. So you can
absolutely, yeah.
In writing.
I can get that to you. Yep, absolutely.
Great. Well, we're going to go ahead and close the webinar for today. If you can move to the next slide, please, Tristan. Just want to thank our panelists today and provide their contact information there. If you have any more questions for them that we did not get a chance to address, or that you didn't get a chance to enter into the question box, please feel free to reach out to them or to me, Rochelle Gruber. We can definitely get you an answer for those. And also, as I stated, we will provide answers to the questions that are existing in the question box now with our follow-up information that you should get in the next couple of days. So thanks again, everyone, for joining today. We certainly appreciate your attendance and your participation and these great questions that came in. We hope you enjoyed it today. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month, where we will do a summary of the Conference on Test Security and the Institute for Credentialing Excellence